24 hours before Thanksgiving 1956, Mount Olive Baptist Church had no food to offer their congregation's neediest families. By dawn Thanksgiving morning, the sanctuary held a feast for 500. Reverend Williams discovered Billie Holiday had worked through the night, using her connections and personal fortune to transform the empty church into Harlem's largest charity dinner. She made him promise to never tell anyone who had done it. For years, it remained Harlem's most beautiful mystery. If you're moved by stories of legendary artists who used their fame to quietly change lives, please subscribe and turn on notifications. What you're about to discover about Billie Holiday's secret charitable empire will completely change how you see this jazz icon forever. Reverend Thomas Williams had been praying for a miracle for 3 weeks. As November 1956 drew to a close, his congregation at Mount Olive Baptist Church faced their bleakest Thanksgiving in memory. The Harlem community was struggling through one of the harshest economic downturns since the Depression, and families who had once been able to provide modest holiday meals for their children now couldn't afford basic groceries. Williams had watched proud men break down in his office, admitting they had no money for Thanksgiving dinner. Mothers came to him with hollow eyes, asking if the church had any food to spare for their hungry children. The Reverend had exhausted every resource available to him. Local businesses were struggling themselves and couldn't donate. The city's welfare programs were overwhelmed and underfunded. Even the traditional community supporters had tightened their purse strings as economic pressures mounted across New York. Mount Olive's own coffers were nearly empty after helping families with rent and utility bills throughout the fall. Williams knew that come Thursday morning he would have to stand before his congregation and deliver the heartbreaking news that there would be no community Thanksgiving dinner this year. What the Reverend didn't know was that his prayers had already been answered by someone he had never met, someone whose life seemed worlds away from the struggles of his Harlem parish. 3 blocks away, in a small apartment above a music store, Billie Holiday had been listening to the neighborhood conversations, hearing the quiet desperation in mothers' voices as they discussed the approaching holiday with dread instead of joy. Holiday had been building her charitable network for over a decade, but few people knew the true extent of her operations. While the public saw Lady Day as the tortured jazz singer battling personal demons, those closest to her knew a different truth. She had quietly become one of Harlem's most generous benefactors, using her performance earnings to support families, pay for children's medical bills, and keep dozens of households from eviction. Her approach was always the same: identify the need, mobilize resources, and ensure her involvement remained completely anonymous. When Holiday learned about Mount Olive's situation, she immediately activated what those in her inner circle called the network. This was an intricate web of relationships she had cultivated with everyone from grocery store owners to truck drivers, from jazz musicians to society ladies who attended her performances. Each person in the network played a specific role, and most had no idea they were part of a larger charitable operation orchestrated by the woman they knew simply as Billie. The planning began on Tuesday evening, November 20th. Holiday called Jimmy Morrison, a produce distributor who supplied restaurants throughout Manhattan. Morrison had been secretly donating surplus food to Holiday's charity work for years, ever since she had paid for his daughter's polio treatment when he couldn't afford it. Within hours, Morrison had identified sources for fresh turkeys, vegetables, and all the fixings needed for a complete Thanksgiving feast for 500 people. But Holiday's network extended far beyond food suppliers. She contacted Sarah Chen, a seamstress in Chinatown who coordinated volunteer labor for Holiday's various charitable projects. Chen, whose family had been saved from deportation when Holiday quietly paid for their legal fees, began calling women throughout the community. By Wednesday morning, a team of 30 volunteers had been assembled, each believing they were helping with a community project sponsored by an anonymous benefactor. As Tuesday night turned to Wednesday, Holiday's apartment became mission control for what would become the largest single charitable operation in Harlem's history. The logistics were staggering. 500 complete Thanksgiving meals meant 2,000 pounds of turkey, hundreds of pounds of vegetables, gallons of gravy, and enough pie to feed a small army. Every detail had to be coordinated perfectly, and everything had to happen without drawing attention to Holiday's involvement. The first challenge was funding. Holiday had just completed a successful 3-week engagement at the Blue Note, earning more money than she had seen in months. Without hesitation, she emptied her bank account, withdrawing nearly $8,000 in cash. This represented not just her recent earnings, but also her savings for the upcoming winter months when club bookings typically slowed down. She made this sacrifice knowing it would leave her financially vulnerable, but the thought of families going hungry on Thanksgiving made her own future security seem trivial. Transportation presented the next hurdle. Holiday contacted Marcus Thompson, a truck driver who had been part of her network since she paid for his mother's funeral 2 years earlier. Thompson arranged for 3 refrigerated trucks to pick up food from various suppliers throughout Wednesday night. To maintain secrecy, each driver was given only partial information about the operation. They knew they were helping with a Thanksgiving charity project, but none knew the ultimate destination or the identity of the organizer. The volunteers faced their own logistical challenges. Holiday had arranged for them to meet at a warehouse in the Bronx, where they would prepare the food before transporting it to Mount Olive. She provided detailed instructions through Sarah Chen, but maintained her anonymity by communicating only through intermediaries. The volunteers believed they were working for a wealthy philanthropist who preferred to remain unnamed, a story that wasn't technically untrue. At 2 o'clock Wednesday morning, Holiday arrived at Mount Olive Baptist Church with a set of keys that Reverend Williams didn't know she possessed. She had obtained them from Deacon Robert Hayes, an elderly parishioner whose grandson she had quietly helped through college. Hayes had been sworn to secrecy and told only that someone wanted to prepare a surprise for the congregation. He had no idea that the surprise would transform his church into the most magnificent Thanksgiving celebration Harlem had ever seen. Working alone in the darkness, Holiday began arranging the sanctuary. She moved pews to create space for long tables, set up serving stations near the altar, and created a kitchen area in the basement using portable equipment she had rented. Every movement was careful and deliberate, as she had only a few hours before the volunteers would arrive with the prepared food. The physical work was exhausting, but Holiday found a strange peace in the quiet sanctuary, surrounded by the simple wooden crosses and hand-painted murals that spoke to the faith of this community. As dawn approached, the first truck arrived, followed quickly by the others. The volunteers, led by Sarah Chen, began the massive task of setting up what would become Harlem's largest Thanksgiving feast. Tables were covered with crisp white linens that Holiday had purchased from a hotel supplier. China and silverware, borrowed from 3 different restaurants whose owners owed Holiday favors, were arranged with military precision. The basement kitchen became a bustling operation as volunteers carved turkeys, prepared side dishes, and plated hundreds of individual meals. Holiday coordinated every aspect of the operation while maintaining her anonymity. She had changed into simple work clothes and kept to the shadows, directing operations through whispered conversations with team leaders. Most volunteers assumed she was just another community member helping with the project. Her fame as Lady Day meant nothing in this context. She was simply another pair of hands working to ensure that families would have a proper Thanksgiving dinner. Reverend Williams arrived at Mount Olive at 6:30 Thursday morning, planning to prepare for what he expected would be a somber Thanksgiving service. He had spent the previous evening writing a sermon about finding hope in difficult times, knowing that many of his congregation would be facing their first holiday without adequate food. As he approached the church, he noticed unusual activity around the building, but assumed it was early parishioners arriving for morning prayer. When Williams unlocked the front door and stepped into the sanctuary, he stopped in complete shock. The transformation was so complete that for a moment he wondered if he had entered the wrong building. Long tables stretched the length of the sanctuary, each one covered with white linens and set with fine china. The air was filled with the rich aromas of roasted turkey, fresh bread, and traditional holiday spices. Volunteers moved efficiently between the kitchen and dining areas, making final preparations for what was clearly a massive Thanksgiving feast. But it was the sight of Billie Holiday that truly amazed the Reverend. She stood near the altar, quietly directing the placement of centerpieces on each table. Williams recognized her immediately, despite her simple clothes and the absence of her usual stage makeup. He had seen her perform at the Apollo Theater and had always admired her music, but he had never imagined she might be connected to his small Harlem church. When their eyes met across the sanctuary, Holiday smiled and walked toward him. There was something almost ethereal about the moment, as if an angel had descended into his church to answer his prayers. Williams later described feeling as though he was witnessing a miracle, not just in the feast that surrounded him, but in the quiet dignity and grace with which this famous woman had chosen to serve his community. Williams found his voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. He asked Holiday how this was possible, how she had managed to transform his empty church into what looked like a scene from a Norman Rockwell painting. Holiday's response was characteristically modest. She simply said that she had heard the community needed help and wanted to do what she could. She downplayed her role, giving credit to the volunteers and emphasizing that this was a community effort. But Williams pressed for details, and gradually the full scope of Holiday's operation became clear. She had personally funded every aspect of the feast, from the food to the tables to the fine china. She had coordinated dozens of volunteers, arranged for transportation, and worked through the night to set up the event. Most remarkably, she had done all of this while maintaining complete anonymity, asking for nothing in return except the satisfaction of knowing that families would have a proper Thanksgiving dinner. The Reverend was particularly moved when Holiday explained her philosophy of giving. She told him that she had been blessed with success in her music career, and she believed that blessing came with responsibilities. She had grown up in poverty herself and remembered the shame of being hungry during holidays. If her music could earn enough money to spare other families that experience, then every sacrifice was worthwhile. She spoke with such sincerity and quiet passion that Williams found himself fighting back tears. Holiday then made a request that surprised the Reverend. She asked him to promise that he would never publicly reveal her involvement in the Thanksgiving feast. She explained that her charitable work was personal and private, not something she wanted to use for publicity or personal gain. She preferred that the community see this as a blessing that had appeared mysteriously rather than as the calculated effort of a celebrity seeking recognition. Williams agreed to this request, though he privately wondered how he would explain the miracle to his congregation. At 9 o'clock Thursday morning, the first families began arriving at Mount Olive Baptist Church. Word had spread through the neighborhood that the church was serving a free Thanksgiving dinner, though no one knew who had made it possible. The families who came were those who had been facing the prospect of a holiday without traditional celebration, single mothers working multiple jobs, elderly residents on fixed incomes, families where unemployment had stretched budgets beyond breaking point. The reactions were everything Holiday had hoped for and more. Children who had been told there might not be a Thanksgiving dinner this year suddenly found themselves in a wonderland of holiday abundance. Parents who had been secretly dreading the holiday discovered that their children would have the same magical Thanksgiving memories that more fortunate families took for granted. Elderly community members who had planned to spend the day alone found themselves surrounded by neighbors and sharing stories over a feast worthy of the finest restaurants. Holiday positioned herself in the kitchen, helping to serve meals and staying largely out of sight. She watched through the serving window as families filled the sanctuary, their faces glowing with surprise and gratitude. She saw children laughing and playing between the tables, parents relaxing for the first time in months, and elderly residents sharing memories of Thanksgivings past. This was the moment that made all her planning and sacrifice worthwhile. The logistical success of the event was remarkable. Despite serving 500 people, everything ran smoothly. There was enough food for everyone, including generous portions and second helpings for those who wanted them. The volunteer system Holiday had organized ensured that every family was served promptly and with dignity. No one felt like they were receiving charity, Instead, everyone felt like they were attending a community celebration where they were honored guests. The moment that would become legendary in Harlem occurred around noon, as the feast was reaching its peak. Reverend Williams had been moving through the sanctuary, greeting families and marveling at the transformation of his church. He found himself overwhelmed by the generosity he was witnessing and the joy on his congregation's faces. But it was when he saw an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson that his emotions finally overcame him. Mrs. Patterson had been a member of Mount Olive for 40 years and had never missed a Thanksgiving service. This year, Williams knew she had been planning to attend church but then return to an empty apartment with nothing but a can of soup for her holiday meal. Her pension barely covered her rent and medication, leaving nothing for holiday luxuries. Now Williams watched as she sat surrounded by neighbors, enjoying a feast fit for royalty, her face radiant with happiness. But it wasn't just Mrs. Patterson's joy that moved the Reverend. It was the sight of Billie Holiday quietly approaching the elderly woman's table, carrying a special plate with extra portions of all the traditional dishes. Holiday knelt beside Mrs. Patterson's chair and spent several minutes talking with her, listening to stories about her late husband and her memories of past Thanksgivings. Williams watched this interaction and realized he was witnessing something sacred. A famous entertainer treating an elderly parishioner with the respect and attention usually reserved for dignitaries. When Holiday returned to the kitchen, Williams followed her. He tried to thank her again, but found himself unable to speak. The magnitude of what she had accomplished, the selflessness of her actions, and the pure joy she had brought to his community overwhelmed him completely. For the first time in his 30 years of ministry, Reverend Williams broke down and wept openly, not from sadness but from witnessing what he later described as the purest expression of Christian love he had ever seen. As the afternoon progressed and Williams composed himself, Holiday began to reveal more about her charitable operations. What he learned astonished him even more than the Thanksgiving feast itself. This wasn't an isolated act of generosity. It was part of a systematic, ongoing effort that had been helping Harlem families for years. Holiday had created what amounted to a private welfare system, funded entirely by her performance earnings and coordinated through her network of grateful recipients and community contacts. Holiday told Williams about the dozen families whose rent she paid monthly, ensuring they wouldn't face eviction. She described the informal scholarship fund she had established, quietly paying for promising students to attend college. She explained how she had been covering medical bills for community members who couldn't afford treatment, working through local doctors who understood her need for anonymity. The scope of her charitable work was staggering, and Williams realized that Billie Holiday had been functioning as Harlem's unofficial guardian angel for years. The Reverend learned that Holiday's charitable philosophy was deeply personal. She had grown up in Baltimore's poorest neighborhoods and understood the daily struggles of working-class families. Her success in the music industry hadn't isolated her from these experiences. Instead, it had given her the resources to address them. She saw her wealth not as personal property but as a tool for community improvement. Every dollar she spent on charity was a dollar invested in creating the kind of community she wished she had grown up in. Williams was particularly impressed by Holiday's organizational skills and attention to detail. She maintained detailed records of every family she helped, tracking their needs and progress over time. She had identified gaps in existing social services and created informal programs to fill them. She had built relationships with local business owners, creating a network of supporters who could provide everything from emergency loans to job opportunities for those she was helping. As the Thanksgiving feast wound down and families began to leave with containers of leftover food, Holiday made her final request of Reverend Williams. She asked him to promise that he would never reveal her involvement in the day's events, not just to protect her privacy, but to preserve the magic of what had happened. She believed that if people knew a celebrity had funded the feast, it would change how they remembered the experience. Instead of feeling blessed by community generosity, they might feel like recipients of celebrity charity. Holiday explained that she preferred people to think of the Thanksgiving feast as a mysterious blessing, perhaps organized by the church itself or by anonymous community members. This would allow families to maintain their dignity while still receiving help. It would also encourage them to believe that their community was capable of taking care of its own, which might inspire future acts of mutual support and generosity. Williams struggled with this request because he wanted to honor Holiday publicly for her extraordinary generosity. He felt that her example could inspire others to similar acts of charity, and that keeping her involvement secret meant losing an opportunity to encourage more community giving. But Holiday was firm in her position, and Williams eventually agreed to maintain her anonymity. He promised that Mount Olive Baptist Church would forever be grateful for the mysterious blessing that had transformed their Thanksgiving. The Reverend did ask if he could find ways to thank Holiday privately, perhaps by helping with her future charitable efforts. Holiday smiled and told him that the joy on his congregation's faces was all the thanks she needed. She did, however, give him a way to contact her through intermediaries if he became aware of families in crisis who needed immediate help. This began a partnership that would continue for years, with Williams discreetly identifying needs and Holiday quietly providing resources to address them. The 1956 Thanksgiving feast at Mount Olive Baptist Church became a legendary event in Harlem, though the true story of its origins remained known only to a few people. Families who attended that day would talk about it for decades, describing it as the most beautiful Thanksgiving they had ever experienced. Children who had been there grew up with memories of abundance and community care that shaped their understanding of what was possible when people worked together. The immediate impact on the community was profound. Families who had been struggling with food insecurity were able to enjoy not just Thanksgiving dinner, but also several days of leftovers that Holiday had deliberately planned for. The feast provided more than nutrition. It offered hope and reminded people that they were part of a community that cared about their well-being. Many families later credited that Thanksgiving as a turning point that helped them get through the difficult winter that followed. Reverend Williams found that the mysterious Thanksgiving feast had transformed his ministry as well. His congregation grew as word spread about Mount Olive as a place where miracles could happen. More importantly, the spirit of generosity that Holiday had demonstrated inspired others in the community to increase charitable giving. Williams began organizing regular community dinners funded by small donations from congregation members who wanted to recreate the magic they had experienced. The feast also strengthened Holiday's resolve to continue her charitable work. Seeing the direct impact of her generosity on hundreds of families reinforced her belief that her success came with responsibilities to help others. She expanded her charitable operations in the following years, helping even more families and developing more sophisticated systems for identifying and addressing community needs. The Thanksgiving feast became a model for future projects, demonstrating how strategic planning and community coordination could maximize the impact of charitable giving. What makes Holiday's Thanksgiving feast even more remarkable is that it represented just one example of charitable work that continued throughout her career. Research conducted decades later revealed that Holiday had been quietly supporting community organizations, individual families, and social causes for most of her adult life. The Mount Olive Thanksgiving feast was extraordinary not because it was unique, but because it was typical of the generosity that defined Holiday's relationship with her community. Holiday's approach to charity was revolutionary for its time. Unlike many celebrities who gave large donations to established organizations, she focused on direct assistance to individuals and families. She understood that sometimes the difference between hope and despair could be as simple as knowing that someone cared enough to ensure you had a proper Thanksgiving dinner. Her charity was personal, immediate, and designed to preserve the dignity of those she helped. The secrecy surrounding Holiday's charitable work means that many of her acts of generosity were never documented or publicly recognized. The families she helped often didn't know who their benefactor was, and Holiday preferred it that way. This approach meant that her charitable legacy was largely hidden from history, known only to those who directly benefited from her generosity and the few people like Reverend Williams who were sworn to secrecy. Modern scholarship has begun to uncover evidence of Holiday's extensive charitable work, revealing a side of her personality that was largely hidden during her lifetime. These discoveries are changing how historians and music fans understand Holiday's character and motivations. The woman who sang about pain and struggle wasn't just expressing personal experience. She was giving voice to the experiences of her entire community and using her success to address the underlying problems that caused that pain. The true story of Mount Olive's Thanksgiving feast remained secret for over 20 years, until Reverend Williams finally felt compelled to share it in his memoirs, published after Holiday's death. Williams explained that he had kept silent during Holiday's lifetime to honor her wishes, but felt that history deserved to know about her extraordinary generosity. His revelation sparked renewed interest in Holiday's charitable work and led to the discovery of numerous other examples of her community involvement. The story of the Thanksgiving feast perfectly captures the complexity of Billie Holiday's character. Here was a woman who struggled with personal demons and faced constant persecution from law enforcement, yet who managed to organize one of the most successful charitable operations in Harlem's history. Her ability to transform personal success into community benefit, while maintaining complete humility about her role, reveals a depth of character that transcends her musical achievements. Today, Mount Olive Baptist Church honors Holiday's memory with an annual Thanksgiving feast, funded by donations from congregation members and community supporters. Reverend Williams's successor continues the tradition, always acknowledging that they are following the example set by an anonymous benefactor whose generosity transformed their community. While Holiday's identity is now known, the church maintains her philosophy of dignity-preserving charity, ensuring that everyone who attends feels like an honored guest rather than a recipient of charity. The feast serves as a reminder that true generosity requires more than money. It requires understanding, planning, and genuine care for those being helped. Holiday's Thanksgiving feast succeeded not just because she provided food, but because she created an experience that honored the families she was helping. She understood that charity given without dignity can be as harmful as no charity at all, and she structured her giving to avoid that trap. Billie Holiday's secret Thanksgiving feast offers lessons that extend far beyond charitable giving. It demonstrates how individual actions, taken with genuine care and proper planning, can have transformative effects on entire communities. Holiday's approach proves that you don't need massive resources or institutional support to make a meaningful difference. You need empathy, creativity, and the willingness to act on your convictions. The story also illustrates the power of anonymous giving. By keeping her involvement secret, Holiday ensured that the focus remained on the families being helped rather than on her own generosity. This approach maximized the positive impact of her charity, while minimizing any potential negative effects on the recipient's self-esteem. Her example suggests that the most effective charity is often the kind that remains invisible to everyone except those directly involved. Perhaps most importantly, Holiday's Thanksgiving feast demonstrates that success creates opportunities for service. Rather than viewing her musical achievements as personal accomplishments to be enjoyed privately, Holiday saw them as tools for community improvement. Her philosophy suggests that those who have been blessed with success have corresponding responsibilities to help others, and that fulfilling these responsibilities can be as rewarding as any personal achievement. The legacy of Mount Olive's mysterious Thanksgiving feast continues to inspire charitable giving and community service throughout Harlem and beyond. Holiday's example reminds us that every person has the potential to be someone else's miracle, and that the most meaningful gifts are often those given in secret, with no expectation of recognition or reward.